When you finish a novel, you are often faced with a rather large question. Should I try to get an agent and traditionally publish it, or should I indie publish it? I'm going to try my best to walk you through the pros and cons of each based on my experiences. I'm Lydia Foxglove, and I am a fantasy author. Before I get into all that, though, I just want to say real quick, a few of you commented on my productivity video where I said that the average writing speed was around 500 to 2,000 words an hour, and after a lot of you said, I write slower than that, I realized that my experience might be biased because most of my sprinting has been done with people who make a living writing, so they probably tend to average a little faster. And I realized I might have made some people feel bad, like they're slow writers. It was not my intention. There are people who have successful careers and they do write at a slow pace, but I'm coming from mainly like commercial fiction, where admittedly it's probably kind of hard to make a solid living if you only write like 200 words an hour. And there's also probably ways to improve your speed if you're interested in that, but I've always written pretty fast, so I don't really have tips for that. I just wanted to say that it is perfectly normal to write less than 500 words an hour, and it does not doom you to failure. Okay, so back to my main topic. My first 5 novels were traditionally published. 3 of them were through Bloomsbury, 2 of them were through Hyperion. And at the time that At the time that I sold these books, self-publishing was not really an option yet. I think there had just started to be some articles about how Amanda Hawking was making money self-publishing. Generally, no one I knew was talking about this as an option. So naturally, I chose the only option, as far as I could tell, aiming for traditional publishing and trying to get an agent. Obviously, I did get the agent. It took 3 years, and then she sold my book pretty quickly after that. And even after the rise of indie publishing, there are still many pros to traditional publishing. I still sometimes look longingly at the shelves of Barnes & Noble, and I think about it. The number one reason why I closed that door is because I really want to write all my books in the same fantasy world, and traditional publishing is not really set up for that. But if it wasn't for that, I might be trying, even as we speak, to sell some like witchy rom-com or something fun. So let's go over some of the pros of traditional publishing. For one thing, the editor that acquires your book in traditional publishing is really passionate about it. The publishing house is paying money for the book, and they're going to spend a lot of time on it. Of course, editors are really overworked, so it might not be as much time as you hoped, but still, the editors that I've worked with have given me some very thoughtful editorial letters, and I feel like writers really improve just by going through the process of getting an agent and trying to get their work up to the standard of traditional publishing. And if you actually work with an editor at a publishing house, it's going to elevate your work even more, and that skill set is going to carry with you for the rest of your career. Another big benefit, of course, is that you get much broader access to libraries, schools. If you're a young adult or middle grade or children's author, that's a huge benefit. And bookstores. Of course, this is not a guarantee. Like sometimes Barnes & Noble doesn't pick up a book even if it's with one of the big publishers. And while you might then be carried in some smaller bookstores, this is a huge blow. But in many cases, you are going to get all this exposure that you wouldn't get at all, or maybe you would get in a very small scale if you did indie publishing. It is also a benefit that the publisher is going to take care of some aspects for you if you're short on time or you're not really sure how to market a book. There have been a lot of articles going around about how increasingly publishers want the author to do all the marketing, and I'm sure there's probably truth in that, but still they're going to handle the cover, they're going to handle the basic packaging. That takes time and money, as well as when you do go to market your book, you're going to already kind of be up on a bit of a pedestal when you say, you know, I'm with Harper, or I'm with Penguin. It's a little easier to get respect, and they might supply, you know, advanced reader copies. There's a lot of things they are going to do that would be very hard for you to do on your own, especially if you're on a tight budget as an indie author. And there is still some legitimacy that traditional publishers convey that I still appreciate. The gatekeepers can be bad, but the gatekeepers can also be good. The average quality of a traditionally published book is still, I think most people would agree, better than an indie published book, which is not to say that there are not pretty bad traditionally published books as well as extremely good indie published books. I'm talking about just like the broad aggregate here. I really love to browse and read physical books. I don't really buy a lot of books online, even paper ones. I really just love the experience of going to a bookstore and choosing a book. So sometimes it makes me kind of sad that I probably wouldn't read my own books because I can't go to the bookstore and pick one out. I might not even know about my own books because I don't do a ton of online browsing, and when I do, it's more likely to be market research about what's popular rather than looking for a book for myself. So sometimes I still yearn to see my book on the shelf at Barnes & Noble. And if your book does happen to blow up and be a big success, rather than trying to scramble with what to do with that success, you already have a team behind you ready to go. If your book does well, they will be more than happy to help you push it out more and more. It's not common, but it would be pretty nice. Now let's talk about some of the negatives of traditional publishing. For one thing, I have a lot of author friends, and I've also had friends that work in publishing, and pretty universally, everyone I met who works in publishing is a pretty cool person who is very passionate about books and stories. They were the kind of person that loved to read. They're smart people who love books, and it's not like they get paid some amazing salary for the hard work that they put into their jobs. It's a passion job. So most editors and book marketing people and copy editors and so on work very hard out of a love of books. Your editor is not going to be like a corporate overlord or something like that. They are truly rooting for you. But with that said, there is a weird thing in traditional publishing where your editor or your marketing person will lie to you. That might sound a little over-exaggerated, and I really hate to say it, but I've talked to enough writers that I know this is a fairly common experience, that they will just tell you something that isn't true. Like when they acquire your book, they might tell you that all these great things are going to happen. But they don't mention that that's only going to happen if there's enthusiasm for your book pre-publication or post-publication or at any point during publication. They make it sound like this is just something that's going to happen. Or they might tell you, I'm going to have an editorial letter for you next week, and then you don't see it for like 2 months. Or they might tell you that your check is coming and your check gets delayed for like 8 months after the period that they tell you you're getting your check soon. This actually happened to a friend of mine, and it's very bad if you're relying on that money. Or they might tell you sales have been pretty good, and then you get your royalty statement and sales have not been pretty good. Sales have been terrible. Why did they tell you that? There is also this weird thing where they'll want you to market your book, but then they won't want you to market it in certain ways, and they won't necessarily communicate to you what those ways are. I have had circumstances where I schmoozed with someone who's having an event, and I thought I was doing a great job, and then I go to my publisher and they're like, no, you're not going to that event. This can get really confusing and frustrating, and I do totally understand why a lot of this happens. I think we've all had the experience where you've told a friend like, oh, I'm going to answer your email, or I'm going to call you next week. I have my schedule really opened up, and then like you don't do it. You totally misjudged your time management skills, and your friend doesn't hear from you for 2 months. So I get why editors also have this problem. They also don't really have much to do with the checks. That's more of like the accounting department or something like that. So they might totally think your check is coming, and they just don't know that accounting is being slow. And they sound enthusiastic about your book and how well it's doing or how well it's going to do because they really hope that that's true. And if they've just acquired your book, they are probably in a rush of excitement themselves and perhaps are just caught up in the moment, aren't thinking about what they might be conveying to you and how bad you might feel when the things they mention don't actually happen. So I don't mean for this to sound malicious. I'm sure editors feel really bad that they're not delivering all of their editorial letters on time, for example. And you know they wish that your book would be a huge hit because they had to go through a whole process to acquire it, and it would be a dream for them if this book they acquired by you was a big success. But sometimes I do wonder if people in publishing are a little afraid of unleashing like a sensitive, crazy author, or I don't know what, but the lack of transparency sometimes can be absolutely maddening. Sometimes when I talk to my friends, a lot of us have described feeling like we're being treated like children. This might be more true because I was in my 20s through most of my career. Maybe if you're like 50, they don't treat you like this. But either way, I was an adult. I was a professional. Yes, I was new to it, but I put in a lot of work and time and study to getting to that point. So it feels a little bit insulting to be treated like you can't handle the truth. And this isn't like everyone in publishing either, but it's common enough that I feel that it's worth bringing up that this may happen. Another con is the lack of control. Of course, it's also a pro that they're taking care of things for you, but it's a con when they hand you your cover and you're like, oh, okay. And your editor will be like, what do you think? We all love it. And you'll just be looking at the email like, ugh. Then you're emailing your agent like, oh my God, they sent me the cover and it's just the ugliest thing I can imagine. And then sometimes you might have had cover approval in your contract, or maybe you're able to bring up a good point and your editor's like, yeah, I see what you mean. Sometimes they go back to the drawing board, but you don't usually have a lot of control over whether that happens. And sometimes you just get an ugly cover or a cover where the tone isn't really right for the book. It can just kind of feel like the luck of the draw, whether you get good packaging for your book. And this can also happen in self-publishing. You're the one making the decision, so it's no longer the luck of the draw. Now it's your own judgment coming into play, and your own judgment is not always right any more than the cover designer at the publishing house is. Once you get into self-publishing, you'll find out really quick whether your instincts about cover design were correct or not. And if you're not able to adapt and pinpoint what makes for a good cover, you're going to be in for a very hard time. You will also lose some control over editing. Typically, when you get an editorial letter, your editor will always say, you know, if you don't agree with any of these suggestions, let me know, we can talk it out. And most of the suggestions I've gotten have been good, but it's like that 5 to 20% that you don't agree with that gets tricky. Sometimes you just say, hey, this didn't feel quite right to me and here's why, and your editor goes, fine, great, that sounds great. Your alternate idea or why that doesn't work, it sounds great. Other times though, they will kind of dig in on it. I had this happen with certain aspects of one of my books and I ended up changing it all, and to this day I just am a little bothered by the things that I changed. It's also true that if there's a lot of things that you want to push back on, you might not end up pushing back on all of them because you feel kind of bad that you're pushing back on so many things, so you might just pick like the top few. It's a bit more of an awkward situation because it's a positive on one hand that you have an editor that is really invested in your book, really loves it. If you pay for an editor, you're not necessarily going to get that level of passion. But on the other hand, if they suggest something and you're paying them, you can just go, nah, that doesn't work for me, I'm not going to do it. If they're paying you, it becomes a lot more awkward. You really, especially when you're new and you haven't had a hit, and you feel like they're taking a chance on you, it can be very hard to push back on an editorial suggestion. Another con, publishers are not going to take all of your books. Inevitably, you're going to have books that you're going to have to face this question of like, how do I self-publish it, or do I just like put it in a drawer, even if you do have a traditionally published career. Unless your first book is a hit, and everything you touch turns to gold, chances are you're going to have a book that they don't want. And it's also difficult to plan a long-term story because they're only going to acquire like 1 to 3 books at a time, unless again you're like a huge author and they're dying to have the next 5 books in your super hot series. Which means that if you're trying to plan out a story with like a big scope, it's very difficult. Your editor might only want 1 book. They're going to send the editorial letter based on suggestions for that 1 book as an isolated unit. You have all these other plans, you have all these other ideas, but they don't care about that. If they just want this 1 book to work, so they're going to make editorial suggestions with that in mind. And they might not want to hear you constantly being like, well, I plan that to happen in book 4, or well, I can't change that because later on this character's going to have this happen in the next cycle of my series. You're just going to have to shrink down your story and look at it in a more narrow view in many cases. It can be very hard, especially for epic fantasy science fiction authors. Like the first book I sold, Bloomsbury didn't want to commit to a sequel until they saw how the first book did. But when we got to the end, I wasn't sure if I should tie everything up, and my editor was like, no, you can kind of leave some cliffhangery aspects. But she hadn't bought the next book yet. So then I'm doing promotional interviews and people keep asking me because they've generally read like an advanced copy, so when's the next book coming out? And I'd be like, I don't know, if ever. And that just, it makes you feel like a single sock drying on a laundry line, just flapping in the breeze, not ever knowing if your pair will be found. They did acquire the second book, luckily, so my editor was not wrong to create the cliffhanger, but I do have to wonder if it affected the sales of the first book a little tiny bit because people didn't know if there was going to be another one. Those are just the kind of micro frustrations that you might end up dealing with. Not that I haven't canceled some of my own indie published series for poor sales as well. So, you know, these things happen. But overall, I had a really good experience in traditional publishing. I would not have traded it. I learned so much working with editors, and it was just generally like a really priceless experience. Another thing that I have to say, I didn't really include it in the pros list because this was just something that like I did as an unasked for experience in publishing. But when I had traditionally published books out, especially the ones with Bloomsbury, I just like went to every event possible. I flew to New York so I could meet my editor. I went to a bunch of trade conferences, like basically anywhere that I could like get a ticket somehow. Sometimes my agent would get me in, or like the library conferences, you can just buy a pass. At least you could at this time. I just kind of like party crashed as many events as possible. And I'm really glad that I did because it was such an amazing experience to be like a part of publishing. I mean, a part of me felt kind of like an orphan child looking in the window because I was there, but no one had really invited me and I wasn't really like famous in any way or doing signings or anything like that. But I have some amazing memories of all of this, like getting to see Bloomsbury's publishing offices in the Flatiron building and having this really nice dinner with my editor. It was so great to just like talk to her. She was super sweet and fun to have conversation with. And I got invited to like a couple of like secret publishing parties and, you know, got to meet people who I had admired, people whose books I had read when I was younger, just kind of geeking out over the whole thing. At one point, I even just like took a sleeping bag to New York so I could go to Book Expo America because I could not afford a hotel room. But some of my friends had a hotel room and they were like, well, you can sleep on the floor. So I had a sleeping bag in my suitcase and it was just like a super awkward trip where I had to tote this like bag and suitcase and sleeping bag. I didn't have keys to the room because I wasn't really staying there exactly. So like I had to stash my suitcase like in a locker thing in the hotel. And then that was really uncomfortable, like more uncomfortable than I had anticipated. So then I'm going around Book Expo America just like asking writer friends, like, do you have a free bed in your hotel room? And I end up sleeping in a different hotel room every single night, rolling my suitcase all around. At one point I was wearing my agent's pajamas. It was, in hindsight, kind of hilarious. And I'm not even an extrovert. It was just like I was really felt like I was where I belonged. It was such a dream to be part of the publishing industry that I was willing to do anything just to feel like I was there. And I have no regrets about that. So if you ever do get a book published, like insert yourself wherever possible if you have any extroverted tendencies whatsoever. I would not do that now though. So now let's talk about some of the pros of self-publishing. If you can manage to get some sense of the market and how to package your books, how to write the blurb, how to get a good cover, there is definitely a huge relief in having control over your work and just being able to experiment, do whatever you feel drawn to. Of course, money is a factor that can prevent you from experimenting as much as you might like because a lot of experimentation costs money, but still there are books where I've bought a second cover for it, or I've done a box set and it did better. And I've also just done like quirky things. Like I can't imagine a publisher telling me to start a YouTube channel and show my old sketchbooks as a marketing tool. And it's not really a marketing tool, but I had such a fun time talking to everybody about that like nerdy childhood experience. Just being able to do fun marketing things without ever worrying whether someone's going to tell you no or tell you what to do in any way or suggest anything. It's very liberating. You can also continue to push your back catalog as much as you want. If you're really passionate about your work and you don't want to give up on it, you can keep rewriting and re-releasing and updating your work, trying to find the audience that it might have missed the first time around, or trying to sell it in a different way with evolving trends. You just have a ton of freedom. If you write quickly, I feel like self-publishing is definitely the only way to go because you have the ability to publish as many books as you want. You can have multiple pen names if you want. You can pivot as much as you want. It can get very overwhelming, but if all you've ever wanted to do is write and you're fast at it, despite all the problems with the modern world, I do think this is still the best time to be a creative that we have had yet because no one can slam the gate on you. Of course, it's still hard to make a living, but throughout all of history, writers and creative people have really struggled to make a living. That's not exactly new. What's nice about now is that there is all this flexibility and the chance that something quirky could break out, or just that you could find like a little tiny audience that just kind of scratches that itch of being a creative for you, even if it's not very lucrative. There's a lot of different paths. This is not to negate the problems and frustrations. I've obviously talked about them before. You guys have talked about it in the comments, and we're going to talk about it again. But sometimes it's worth noting the positives of the world we live in now. And one of them is that there is more wiggle room to try different things and make a living as a creative. Another positive about self-publishing is that there is the potential to make more money. And sure, many of you watching are probably like, well, I haven't made any money, Lydia. And you know, fair enough. I've had books that haven't made like any money. I've had books that have lost a few $1,000s. But traditional publishing you will get in advance, but the advance might be incredibly tiny. What's less likely is that you're going to have a book that makes like a living wage. When I hang out with traditionally published people now, all they're talking about is how incredibly hard it is to make a living and how much they're struggling. And then when I go into indie, a lot of times you get a lot of people, they're just like, I made 6 figures this year. So this is certainly not to say that everyone is making a lot of money. Just that there is more money in self-publishing than I ever saw before self-publishing existed. There is a potential to make a true living wage, or even to be like making sports car money. This can be frustrating if you're trying to do well and it's just not clicking for you. But in a broad sense, it's nice to see so many people making money. Another pro is that you have a lot of close connection to your reader base. You can do things like a poll. Hey, what do you guys want to see? I'll do like a free short story. Which character do you want it to be about? You can do a lot of different things where you're asking for feedback from people. You can write whatever they're asking you for. And if you write quickly, you can get it out quickly. And either way, when you publish a book, you have the choice to put it out quickly when you're still really excited about it. At least this is my experience, is that when I've finished a book fairly recently, I'm extremely excited to talk about it. But like 2 years later, I've completely forgotten about the book and I don't really have that much to say about it anymore, unless it was characters that I have like a very long relationship with, like an ongoing relationship, which I do have those characters. But like Between the Sea and Sky is actually one of my favorite books that I've written, but it took almost 2 years from when I turned it in to when it was published. And by the time it was published, I'd kind of moved on to thinking about other books. So when I'm trying to market it, I'm just not like fired up anymore. I really like how in indie publishing, I can release the book while I'm fired up about it, and I'm super excited to talk about it and market it. I mean, except for the fact that marketing just kind of sucks, but now let's talk about some of the downsides of indie publishing. Of course, the big one is that you have complete control. This is one of the positives, and it's also a huge negative sometimes. If you can get a handle on what sells, and you're packaging your books well, and they're moving, and you're making money, and everything's great, then great. Some people just like get it, but a lot of people don't get it. Your book's not selling, and the only person you have to blame is yourself. And you might not really know exactly what you did wrong. I've seen people who struggle book after book. They publish one, there's a million things wrong with it, obviously, and then they end up getting some feedback from the community maybe. The next one's a lot better. The cover's better, the blurb is better. Everything about it is better, and yet something is still off, and the book still barely sells any more copies than the last book. This can be an absolute nightmare. You can get so confused, so frustrated. On top of that, you might just be really busy and it's hard to juggle all the pieces of indie publishing. I know when I'm really busy, it's so much easier to devote the time to writing the next book than it is to marketing, even though sometimes I probably should be doing the marketing. But when you don't have time to write, well, I'm really in this to write. And book marketing is such the opposite of focusing on your novel, getting lost in it, getting the words down. Book marketing is the scatterbrained thing where you got to keep up with like a calendar. You got to remember, oh yeah, I got to send a newsletter out on this day for this promo. Oh, and I had this Facebook ad running and now it's been a few days. So now I got to look at the metrics and I got to see what I can tweak. And I have Amazon ads running and I got to fix those. And oh, I got to talk to this person about this promotional opportunity. It's like a million little things at a million different times, and I have the worst time trying to focus on all those things at once. I very rarely participate in group promos or newsletter swaps or anything where I have to keep track of doing a thing on a certain day because I am terrible about that, and it's too bad because that is a very good, free to cheap promotional opportunity, but it's so hard. Another thing about self-publishing is that it's only a certain segment of the market. It leans more to very commercial genres with very voracious readers. It leans to stories that really push readers' buttons, satisfy them in kind of base ways, for lack of a better word. There's not much in the way of like literary fiction. Also, it's hard to reach children's book markets. And it's hard to sell things that are quirky. I mean, it's always kind of hard to sell things that are quirky, but sometimes in traditional publishing, you luck out and people really get it and see a path to selling it, but you really need that publisher backing to kind of sell this quirky thing. But there is a pro that I almost forgot to mention, and that is that you can adapt to emerging trends very quickly, things that are coming out of like fan fiction or fan communities. I don't think we'd have genres like reverse harem or lit RPG, for example, if not for self-publishing's ability to just like pick up a thing and run with it. And another con, I'm sorry these lists are not turning out to be very organized. I find it much harder to make friends in the indie community than the traditionally published community, and I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I think to me it kind of feels like traditional publishing is like a small town where people become very close-knit because there's a lot of hardship and there's a lot of like love and passion for this hometown, which sounds funny because, you know, we're just writers. But I think in traditional publishing, there was a lot of people that like were really passionate for the books that they grew up reading, and that kind of united us all, this real love for literature. Whereas in indie publishing, because there is a lot more potential to make money, it feels more like moving to a very fast-paced big city where people have high-powered jobs with six-figure salaries and they're really busy, they're go, 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 they just moved there, they don't have any community ties, they don't have a lot of time. I mean, this is a broad generalization. This is just like my theory for maybe why it's been harder for me to make friends. Part of it might just be because I'm older, and part of it might be that social media is very monetized as well. And I made most of my traditionally published friends a while ago, like during the live journal days. But I do feel like there's kind of a difference between the two communities, and I just relate a little better to traditionally published authors to some extent. So most of my good friends now tend to be people who started in traditional publishing and had some books out, or at least were very involved in trying, and now are in indie publishing, but they kind of know both sides. It also might help if I was able to go to more conferences and events like I used to when I was young. But travel's hard for me now for some various reasons, like cats. I don't really get to meet people in person, so that might be unique to me, but to me that has been a con. I also feel like there's more kind of like scamming and like petty behavior and drama in indie publishing. That's also not universal by any means. Most people are just like people who want to write. But again, there's more money on the table. Whenever you have amateurs and the potential to make money, you also get scammers, so just be careful. So ultimately, there are good and bad points to both options, and I would not necessarily say there's like a one-size-fits-all choice. I've also seen an increasing number of publishers picking up indie books and giving them the backing and the wider distribution so that now those books are appearing on the shelf at Barnes & Noble, and this is really the dream for me now. I have no control over it. I don't expect it. But it would be so amazing if I had a book that took off in indie publishing and a traditional publisher came to me and offered me a deal to be back in bookstores again. But other than that, I don't personally have any plans to return to traditional publishing. And a big reason for that is just because I'm working with my big fantasy world now. So it's always a possibility if I wrote something else later. I bear no ill will to traditional publishing. I had a really good relationship with my agent and generally positive experiences with editors. I particularly got along really well with my Bloomsbury editor. So even though not everything was perfect, it isn't something I would universally say like, oh, stay away from traditional publishing, it's just a disaster. But when I moved into indie publishing, that definitely felt like the right thing at the right time and has been a net positive for me. And I've definitely done better in indie publishing, although most of that is from being prolific. So I'm not giving you any answers. You have to choose your own adventure here. But I hope this helped. I probably forgot some things, but I know when I'm planning out these videos, I always have this nagging feeling of things that I forgot, but that's what the comments are for. If you have any questions or there's anything you can think of, if you've had any experiences, feel free to drop it in the comments. And then any questions that arise, I can answer in my weekly Q&A, which is always free to my Substack and Patreon members. I also have a $5 tier on Patreon that gets you my Discord server, bonus videos, and who knows what else in the future. But I appreciate each and every one of you just for being here. And whichever path that you choose or have taken in your writing career, I wish you all the best. I hope this was helpful and useful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.